They gave the farmland to my cousin, who never worked a day. So I fought back in court. Chapter 1. The will reading. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and broken dreams. I sat there in my best clothes, which weren't saying much, while my cousin Marcus adjusted his expensive tie for the third time. We'd been waiting for this moment since Grandpa Joe passed 2 months ago, though I never imagined it would feel this heavy. The farmland had been in our family for 4 generations. Every sunrise for the past 15 years, I'd walked those fields, checking crops, mending fences, and breathing life into soil that my great-grandfather first tilled. Marcus, meanwhile, lived in the city, visiting maybe twice a year for Christmas and Easter, always complaining about the smell of manure and the lack of decent coffee shops. Attorney Richardson cleared his throat and began reading. The first few paragraphs were standard legal jargon, but then came the bombshell that would change everything. The 200-acre farm, complete with the farmhouse, barn, and all equipment, was being left to Marcus. To me, the person who'd sacrificed college, relationships, and countless opportunities to keep the family legacy alive, Grandpa Joe left his old pickup truck and $1,000. I felt the blood drain from my face as Marcus tried to suppress a smile. This had to be a mistake. Grandpa Joe knew how much the farm meant to me. He'd always said I had dirt in my veins and that the land would be mine someday. But here we were, and the legal document in front of us said otherwise. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Marcus was already talking about selling to developers, turning our family's heritage into another strip mall. That's when I knew I had to fight. Chapter 2. The shock sets. In driving home in Grandpa Joe's rusty pickup, apparently my only inheritance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The truck wheezed and coughed as I pulled into the farmhouse driveway, the same driveway I'd helped Grandpa repave just 2 summers ago when Marcus was too busy with his marketing job to visit. The farmhouse looked different now, knowing it wasn't mine. Every board I'd helped replace, every window I'd fixed during storms, every coat of paint I'd applied, all of it now belonged to someone who saw it as nothing more than a real estate transaction. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes, just staring at the porch where Grandpa and I used to shell peas and plan the next season's planting. My phone rang. It was Sarah, my neighbor, and the closest thing I had to a girlfriend, though we'd never made it official. She'd been expecting this call. "How did it go?" she asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice that maybe, just maybe, things had worked out the way they should have. I told her everything. The silence on the other end stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "That's not right," she finally said. "Your grandfather loved that farm, and he loved you. There has to be more to this story." She was right. Grandpa Joe had been sharp as a tack right up until the end. The man who'd taught me to read the weather by watching the clouds and predict market prices by understanding people wouldn't just hand over his life's work to someone who'd rather pave it than preserve it. Something wasn't adding up, and I was determined to find out what. Chapter 3. Digging for Truth. The next morning, I drove into town to visit Mrs. Patterson, Grandpa Joe's longtime friend and the closest thing he had to a confidant after Grandma died. She lived in a small house behind the library, surrounded by rose gardens that rivaled anything you'd see in magazines. She'd been expecting me. "I figured you'd come by," she said, pouring sweet tea into mason jars on her kitchen table. "Joe talked about you all the time, you know, about how you were the only one who really understood the farm." I explained what had happened at the lawyer's office, watching her face grow more troubled with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her roses. "Something's not right about this whole thing," she said finally. "Your grandfather came by here about 6 months before he passed. He was excited about updating his will, said he wanted to make sure everything was perfect for you, said you'd earned every acre." This confirmed what I'd suspected. Grandpa Joe wouldn't have changed his mind without good reason, and there was no good reason to give the farm to Marcus. Mrs. Patterson suggested I look through Grandpa's papers more carefully, maybe visit his old attorney, not Richardson, but the man who'd handled his affairs for decades. The plot was thickening, and I was starting to realize this might be about more than just family favoritism. There were forces at work here that I didn't yet understand, but I was determined to uncover them. The farm was worth fighting for, not just for me, but for everyone who'd poured their sweat and dreams into that soil. My grandfather's legacy deserved better than becoming another casualty of greed. Chapter 4. The Paper Trail. Attorney Morrison's office was nothing like Richardson's polished setup. Located above a hardware store on Main Street, it looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, but Morrison himself was sharp and methodical. He'd handled Grandpa Joe's legal affairs for 30 years and seemed genuinely surprised to hear about the will reading. "That's strange," he said, pulling out a thick file. "Joe came to me last spring wanting to update his will. We spent hours going over every detail. He was very specific about leaving the farm to you, with provisions to ensure it stayed in agricultural use." My heart started pounding. Morrison showed me the will he'd drafted, the real will, dated just 8 months ago. In it, I inherited the farm with all its equipment and livestock, while Marcus received a cash settlement and some stocks. It was exactly what I'd expected, exactly what Grandpa Joe had always promised. "But this isn't the will that was read yesterday," I said, comparing the documents. Morrison's face darkened as he examined Richardson's version. The signatures looked similar, but something was off about the formatting and language. More importantly, this newer will was dated just 3 weeks before Grandpa Joe died, a time when he was heavily medicated and barely conscious. "I need to make some calls," Morrison said grimly. "If what I'm thinking is true, we're dealing with fraud here. Someone wanted that farm very badly, and they weren't above forging documents to get it." I left his office with copies of the real will and a growing sense of determination. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about justice. Someone had manipulated a dying man's final wishes, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The fight was just beginning. Chapter 5. Building the Case. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal preparation. Morrison worked with forensic document experts while I gathered evidence of my continuous work on the farm. Bank records showing equipment purchases I'd made, receipts for seed and fertilizer, photos of improvements I'd completed, everything that proved my deep involvement in keeping the farm operational. Sarah helped organize everything, her background in bookkeeping proving invaluable. We created timelines, catalogued photographs, and reached out to neighbors who could testify about my role versus Marcus's absence. The evidence was overwhelming. I was the heart and soul of that farm's operation. The document analysis came back first. The forensic expert confirmed that while the signature appeared authentic, the paper and ink were inconsistent with the date claimed. More damning, the will's language differed significantly from Morrison's typical style, something Richardson apparently hadn't considered when commissioning the forgery. But we needed to prove who was behind it. Marcus seemed the obvious suspect, but he'd appeared genuinely surprised at the reading. That left us looking at Richardson himself, who had both the means and opportunity to create fraudulent documents. Financial records showed he'd recently invested heavily in a development company, the same one Marcus had mentioned wanting to sell to. The pieces were falling into place. Richardson had likely approached Marcus with a deal. Fake the will, split the proceeds from selling to developers. What they hadn't counted on was my determination to fight, or Morrison's meticulous record-keeping. We filed a motion to contest the will, officially beginning what would become the most important legal battle of my life. The farm that had shaped 4 generations of my family was worth fighting for, no matter how long it took. Chapter 6. The opposition responds. Richardson's response to our legal challenge was swift and aggressive. Within days, he filed counter-motions, claiming our forensic analysis was flawed and that Morrison's will was actually the forgery. He painted me as a disgruntled relative, unable to accept Grandpa Joe's final decision, suggesting that my grandfather had grown tired of my controlling behavior regarding the farm. The accusations stung because they twisted truth into lies. Yes, I'd been protective of the farm's operations. Yes, I'd sometimes disagreed with Grandpa about modernization plans or crop rotation. But these were the natural tensions between generations of farmers, not evidence of a rift that would cause him to disinherit me. Marcus, meanwhile, had gone silent. Sarah mentioned seeing him at the diner looking troubled and distracted, not like someone celebrating a windfall. This made me wonder if he was having second thoughts about whatever arrangement he'd made with Richardson. Morrison advised patience. Legal battles like this are won with evidence, not emotion, he reminded me. Richardson is counting on us making mistakes out of anger. We won't give him that satisfaction. The waiting was torture. Every morning I woke up in the farmhouse, uncertain how many more mornings I'd be able to do so. The crops needed attention, but investing in improvements felt foolish when ownership was in dispute. The farm existed in limbo, just like my future. Local support began building as word spread through town. Neighbors who'd watched me work the land for years signed affidavits supporting my character and commitment. The hardware store owner testified about the thousands of dollars in supplies I'd purchased for farm maintenance. Even the bank president confirmed my responsible management of agricultural loans. Truth was on our side, but in court, truth doesn't always win. Chapter 7. Unexpected ally. 3 weeks into the legal battle, Marcus appeared at my door. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed and unshaven, like he hadn't slept in days. I almost didn't let him in, but something in his expression made me step aside. "We need to talk," he said, settling heavily at the kitchen table where we'd shared countless family meals growing up. What he told me changed everything. Richardson had approached him months before Grandpa Joe's death, claiming the old man was planning to leave everything to charity out of spite over family disputes that didn't exist. Richardson offered a solution. For a small fee, he could ensure Marcus inherited the farm, which Marcus could then sell and split the proceeds with Richardson's development partners. "I thought I was preventing Uncle Joe from making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richardson showed me papers that looked official, claimed Uncle Joe was angry about you taking over his decisions. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The money would have solved my problems. Marcus was drowning in debt from poor investments and a costly divorce. The farm sale would have been his lifeline, but guilt was eating him alive. He'd seen how I'd reacted to losing the farm and realized Richardson had manipulated them both. "I never meant to steal from you," he said. "I thought I was helping the family by preventing Uncle Joe from giving everything away to strangers." Richardson made it sound like you'd still get something substantial, just not the farm itself. This revelation was the break we needed. Marcus agreed to testify about Richardson's manipulation and provide evidence of their communications. Suddenly, our case shifted from proving document forgery to exposing a conspiracy to defraud an elderly man and his family. The real battle was just beginning. Chapter 8. The investigation deepens. With Marcus cooperating, Morrison hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Richardson's activities. What we discovered was disturbing. Our case wasn't isolated. Richardson had been involved in at least 6 similar situations over the past 2 years, always involving elderly clients with valuable property and always resulting in sales to the same development group. The pattern was sophisticated. Richardson would identify vulnerable elderly clients with substantial assets, then manipulate family members by creating fictional conflicts and offering solutions that benefited his development partners. The legal fees and commissions generated millions in profits while families lost their generational wealth. Sarah spent hours at the courthouse researching public records, tracking down other families who might have been victims. She found the Hendersons, who'd lost their 150-year-old farmhouse to development after a suspicious will change. The Kowalskis had seen their family business sold under similar circumstances. In every case, Richardson was the attorney of record, and the same development company was the buyer. The State Bar Association launched their own investigation after Morrison filed a formal complaint. Criminal fraud charges seemed likely, but that wouldn't automatically reverse the damage already done to other families. We were fighting not just for our farm, but to expose a pattern of elder abuse that had destroyed multiple families. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between a hard-working farmer and corrupt developers. The publicity brought forward additional witnesses and victims, strengthening our case, but also increasing the pressure on Richardson to fight harder. He responded by hiring expensive out-of-town lawyers and filing frivolous motions designed to drain our resources. The stakes were rising, and I wondered if we had the stamina for a prolonged battle. Chapter 9. Community Support. The story spread beyond our small town when a regional newspaper picked it up. Family farm versus corporate greed, the battle for America's agricultural heritage, ran as a front-page feature, complete with photos of me working the fields and quotes from neighbors about the farm's importance to the community. The response was overwhelming. Letters of support arrived daily, some containing small donations to help with legal expenses. A retired attorney from the state capitol offered to assist Morrison pro bono. Agricultural organizations issued statements supporting our case as representative of threats facing family farms nationwide. Most importantly, other Richardson victims began contacting us directly. Mrs. Chen, whose family had lost a restaurant property under suspicious circumstances, provided financial records showing the same patterns we'd identified. The Hendersons shared documentation of pressure tactics Richardson had used on their dying father. Each new case strengthened our position and demonstrated the scope of Richardson's scheme. The development company Richardson represented tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance of any fraudulent activities. But their pattern of purchases, always at below market prices, always from Richardson clients, always followed by immediate demolition and redevelopment, suggested deeper involvement. A GoFundMe campaign someone created without my knowledge raised enough money to cover our legal expenses through trial. The support was humbling, but also pressure-filled. This case had become symbolic of broader struggles between individual rights and corporate power, between tradition and progress, between justice and profit. I tried to stay focused on the simple truth. Grandpa Joe wanted me to have the farm because I'd earned it through years of dedication. Everything else was noise, but noise that was building into a roar that demanded justice. Chapter 10. Pre-trial maneuvering. Richardson's new legal team launched a media offensive designed to discredit our case and paint me as an opportunist exploiting public sympathy. They leaked selective information, suggesting Grandpa Joe had been frustrated with my modernization resistance and had genuinely wanted Marcus to inherit the property for development purposes. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Neighbors who'd known Grandpa Joe for decades came forward with stories contradicting Richardson's narrative. The retired principal from the local school testified that Grandpa Joe had frequently praised my dedication during community meetings. The pastor from his church confirmed that Grandpa Joe had recently discussed his pride in my stewardship of the family land. More damaging to Richardson was the discovery of offshore accounts connected to his law practice. Financial investigators traced payments from development companies through shell corporations to accounts Richardson controlled. The money trail painted a clear picture of corruption that went far beyond our individual case. Marcus's testimony during depositions was devastating to Richardson's position. He provided detailed accounts of their conversations, including recordings he'd made on his phone when he began suspecting Richardson's motives. The recordings captured Richardson discussing strategies to manipulate elderly clients and divide families to facilitate property transfers. Morrison felt confident about our chances at trial, but warned that Richardson still had resources and connections that could complicate our victory. "Justice and winning aren't always the same thing," he reminded me. "We need to be prepared for any outcome." The trial date was set for 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to determine whether generations of family dedication would be honored or whether greed and manipulation would prevail. The farm continued operating in uncertainty, but the crops didn't care about legal battles. They just needed attention, just like they always had. Chapter 11. The trial begins. The courthouse was packed when our trial began on a crisp October morning. Farmers from across 3 counties filled the gallery, their weathered faces reflecting solidarity with our cause. Television cameras lined the hallway as reporters prepared to cover what local media called the trial of the decade. Richardson arrived with 4 attorneys in expensive suits, projecting confidence and corporate power. By contrast, Morrison and our volunteer legal team looked like what we were, small-town practitioners fighting for principle rather than profit. But appearances can be deceiving, and Morrison had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The jury selection process revealed the community divide our case had created. Urban professionals tended to view property inheritance as purely legal matters, while rural residents understood the deeper meaning of generational land stewardship. Morrison worked to seat jurors who could appreciate both the legal complexities and the human elements of our situation. Richardson's opening statement painted Grandpa Joe as a man tired of family conflicts who'd made a reasoned decision to leave the farm to Marcus for development into housing that the community needed. He characterized me as unable to accept that farming was no longer economically viable and unwilling to respect an elderly man's final wishes. Morrison's opening was simpler but more powerful. He told the story of 4 generations of family dedication to the land, of my sacrifice and commitment, and of a conspiracy to defraud an elderly man and steal his family's heritage. "This case is about whether greed and manipulation can triumph over truth and justice," he concluded. The first witnesses would be crucial in establishing the credibility of each side's narrative. Everything we'd worked for came down to the next few days of testimony. Chapter 12. The evidence unfolds. Our first witness was Mrs. Patterson, who testified about Grandpa Joe's excitement over updating his will to ensure I inherited the farm. Her detailed account of their conversation 6 months before his death directly contradicted Richardson's timeline and demonstrated Grandpa Joe's clear intentions. The document expert's testimony was technical, but damning. Using enlarged exhibits, she showed the jury specific inconsistencies in paper stock, ink composition, and formatting that proved Richardson's will was fraudulent. Richardson's attorneys tried to challenge her credentials and methodology, but her reputation was impeccable. Marcus's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of our case. He described Richardson's manipulation tactics, his own financial desperation, and the guilt he felt upon realizing how his actions had betrayed family trust. The recordings he'd made were played for the jury, capturing Richardson's casual discussion of manipulating elderly clients. "I thought I was preventing my grandfather from making a mistake," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. Instead, I helped steal from the one person who truly deserved his legacy. I'm here to make that right. Richardson's cross-examination of Marcus was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. His attorneys tried to portray Marcus as an unreliable witness, motivated by immunity from prosecution. But his obvious remorse and detailed knowledge of Richardson's scheme made him credible. The prosecution of our case was building momentum, but Richardson's defense hadn't begun yet. His expensive legal team surely had strategies we hadn't anticipated, and the next phase would test whether our truth could withstand their professional assault. The farm's future hung in the balance as we prepared for Richardson's counterattack. Chapter 13. The Defense Strikes Back. Richardson's defense team launched a sophisticated strategy designed to muddy the waters and create reasonable doubt about our allegations. Their first witness was a psychiatrist who testified that elderly individuals often make unexpected inheritance decisions due to cognitive changes that families don't recognize or accept. Without directly challenging Grandpa Joe's competency, which would have been difficult given medical records showing his mental acuity, they suggested that family members often misinterpret an elderly person's true feelings about inheritance. They painted my dedication to the farm as potentially overwhelming to Grandpa Joe, suggesting he may have felt pressured to promise me something he later reconsidered. Their most dangerous witness was a handwriting expert who disputed our forensic analysis. Using different methodology and focusing on different aspects of the signature, he claimed the questioned will could indeed be authentic. The technical nature of his testimony was confusing, which seemed to be the point. If jurors couldn't understand the evidence, they might doubt its reliability. Richardson himself took the stand, presenting as a respected community attorney shocked by accusations of fraud. He claimed Marcus had approached him with concerns about family disputes and that he'd simply followed standard legal procedures in drafting a new will. He suggested our conspiracy theory was the product of a disappointed heir, unable to accept his grandfather's final decision. His testimony was smooth and professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent decades manipulating legal situations. But Morrison's cross-examination began exposing cracks in his facade. Questions about his unusual relationship with the development company, his pattern of elderly client will changes, and his offshore financial arrangements gradually revealed a more sinister picture. The battle for the jury's belief was intensifying as both sides prepared their final arguments. Chapter 14. Final Arguments and Verdict. Morrison's closing argument was passionate but grounded in evidence. He walked the jury through our case methodically. The forensic proof of document forgery, the pattern of similar fraudulent activities, Marcus's testimony about Richardson's manipulation, and the overwhelming evidence of my commitment to the farm versus Marcus's indifference. This case is about more than one family's inheritance, he told the jury. It's about whether we'll allow greed and corruption to destroy the bonds between generations, whether we'll let sophisticated criminals prey on elderly citizens and tear apart families for profit. The evidence shows clearly that James earned this farm through 15 years of dedication and that his grandfather intended him to inherit it. Richardson's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt and the complexity of family relationships. His attorney argued that we'd constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain away an uncomfortable truth, that Grandpa Joe had genuinely reconsidered his inheritance plans. He urged jurors not to be swayed by emotion or public sympathy, but to focus on the legal requirements for proving fraud. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. During the wait, I walked the farm's perimeter, touching fence posts I'd replaced and checking fields I'd planted, wondering if this might be my last opportunity to do so as the rightful owner. The uncertainty was excruciating, but the crops continued growing regardless of human legal complications. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent, except for the judge's voice reading the verdict. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." Richardson's forged will was declared invalid, Morrison's will was recognized as authentic, and I was declared the rightful owner of the farm. But more than individual victory, the verdict represented justice for all families victimized by Richardson's scheme and sent a message that elder abuse and inheritance fraud wouldn't be tolerated in our community. Chapter 15. Justice and New Beginnings. The aftermath of the trial brought both relief and responsibility. Richardson faced criminal fraud charges and disbarment proceedings, while the development company settled civil suits with multiple victims rather than face further investigation. Marcus and I began the difficult process of rebuilding our relationship, united by shared recognition of how manipulation had nearly destroyed our family. The farm required immediate attention after months of uncertainty. With Sarah's help, our relationship had deepened during the crisis. I developed plans for sustainable improvements that honored both tradition and progress. The legal battle had taught me the importance of documenting everything, so we established detailed records of all operations and decisions. Community support continued beyond the trial's end. Local farmers offered assistance with planting and harvest. Neighbors helped repair equipment that had been neglected during the legal proceedings, and the Agricultural Extension Office provided expertise for modernization projects that would improve efficiency without compromising the farm's character. Marcus used his settlement from the Criminal Restitution Fund to pay off his debts and start fresh. He began visiting the farm regularly, not as an absent relative, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding our family's agricultural heritage. His children, my second cousins, discovered the joy of collecting eggs and feeding chickens, connecting with their roots in ways Marcus never had. The story attracted attention from agricultural advocacy groups and legal reform organizations working to protect elderly citizens from inheritance fraud. Our case became a precedent for prosecuting similar crimes and led to stronger legal protections for elderly property owners. Standing in the same fields where my great-grandfather first planted crops over a century ago, I realized this battle had been about more than land ownership. It was about the principle that dedication and integrity should be rewarded, that families shouldn't be torn apart by greed, and that sometimes fighting for what's right requires risking everything you value. The farm was secure, but more importantly, its future was bright. The next generation would inherit not just land, but the knowledge that sometimes you have to fight for what matters most. Thank you so much for listening to this story of family, justice, and the fight to preserve generational legacy. This tale reminds us that sometimes standing up for what's right requires courage, determination, and the support of community. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of triumph over adversity. Your support helps me continue sharing these important tales of justice and family values. Until next time, remember that truth and dedication can overcome even the most sophisticated schemes when good people stand together for what's right.